Welcome back after this non-break. So Alberto Oli was saying that it's a good example of revealed preferences. So, which should not be, which should also attract our attention to the differences between the real utility and the welfare utility, so there may be two different things. Anyway, we should start. So this second panel is about understanding individual choices in health. So we're going to talk. We're going to switch our attention from public policies or public decision making to trying to understand better individual choices, individual decisions, and how, of course, these a better understanding of individual health behaviors may also be helpful to design better policies and to figure out what could be a welfare criteria or a social welfare criteria on which public decisions would be based. Now, the title is Understanding Individual Choices, not individual preferences and not individual behaviors. Of course, understanding choices is much more difficult than understanding behaviors, because if we want to understand choices, we need to observe not only actual behaviors, but also what could have been possible. So potential behaviors, and that's a lot more difficult. And so there's lots of techniques in trying to elicit choices or trying to elicit preferences from observed choices and decisions, and like putting individuals in a very controlled setting, or at the opposite, using historical data on what actually people did. So lots of different issues, and of course, it's not that simple to separate this issue from the previous one. There's, to some degree, the way we ask the question about understanding or looking at individual choices is, of course, directly related to the objective of designing better policies, at least in part. And so without further delay, I would like to introduce the speakers. So the first speaker will be Mandy Ryan from the University of Aberdeen. And Mandy has been working extensively on cost benefit, cost utility, and eliciting, of course, individual preferences in that setup. Nicolas Jacquemet will be the second to speak, and Nicolas has also been involved in experimental economics, and probably we'll talk a little bit about that. Then Matteo Galizzi from LSE. Very happy to see you again, Matteo. Matteo was the chair last year for a year, and is still has close connections. And Matteo will probably talk about behavioral economics and what we can learn also from this trend of research to address our question here. And Andrew Clark, who is a professor at PSC, and who will talk about happiness. So I thought it was a good way to end up with talking about happiness rather than starting with happiness and then moving towards sadness. We should go the other way around. Okay, so Mandy, you have 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, particularly Lise, for the invitation. It's always nice to come to Paris. So what Lise asked me to talk about, which wasn't really a surprise, was a methodology known as discrete choice experiments. Put your hand up if you're familiar with discrete choice experiments. Okay, so I have to give you the crash course in discrete choice experiments over the next 10 minutes. So obviously it will be just a feel for the method. And my plan is tomorrow, when we have the panel session around behavioural economics, is talk about how some of the methods from behavioural economics can be used to look at the validity of this technique. But for now, I'm going to talk about the method itself. So discrete choice experiments, not very attractive, not very appealing in the name, but let's hope in 10 minutes you can think, yes, I can see how that can work for me. So the key thing, one of the key things to note about a discrete choice experiment is that it's an economic measure of value. And I think for the non-economists out there, we can very much distinguish a key feature of economic techniques which make them different from other health service research methods that we might use to elicit preferences. Key to economics is the concept of opportunity cost. The idea something's only of value if we're willing to give something up for it. So if we use the QALY framework, as we've been introduced to earlier this afternoon, behind that we use standard gamble and time trade-off to elicit those Q or the utility weights. Standard gamble, we trade risk. Time trade-off, we trade time. We've also heard about willingness to pay. We trade money. In choice experiments, we trade attributes. So the key thing is we need to be able to define our policy question in terms of attributes. But before I move on to that, I have to give you a tip for the PhD students out there who may have an economics exam coming up. Economists love this concept of opportunity cost. So if ever you don't know the answer to a question, my suggestion is you write opportunity cost on every second line. Put a few words around it, and the economists will love it. What do you reckon, Lise? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the discrete choice experiment, the opportunity cost, or the concept of trading, is around dimensions or attributes. So if we can break our research question or policy question down into attributes, then we can potentially use a discrete choice experiment. So what do I mean by attributes? So part of the appeal, and I'll give you some history in a wee while about how we as health economists started to use choice experiments, very much within the economic evaluation domain. But if we think, one of the reasons I think choice experiments appealed to me as a young, quite a few years ago, PhD student looking for alternative measures of value to the QALY was that I think it gives you the type of questions that it's argued we face on a daily basis. People face choices about attribute-based decisions. So perhaps you're thinking of going on holiday, you're going to fly. Will you go with Air France? Probably a wee bit more expensive. But you'll get a little bit of food from experience. The sandwich was quite nice yesterday. You get pretty good leg room. And you know, I think, if the flight is cancelled, they'll put you up in a hotel for a night, or at least that's the more expensive British Airways. Or do you go for one of these budget airlines? There is one by the name of Ryanair, which has nothing to do with me, where you pay less. You're not even guaranteed a seat. You're all dashing to get the seat you want. Of course, there's no frills. There's certainly no food. And if Ryanair get their way, they'll be charging for the toilet soon. So this is the kind of idea. We make these attribute-based decisions on a daily basis. And having worked in this area for many years, I think one of the most interesting applications of choice experiments I've seen is apparently we use it to make life decisions such as choosing our partner. We make trade-offs, and our trade-offs apparently change as we get older. So I'll leave that one with you to ponder. So within health economics, this technique is used if we have an attribute question, research question. So I'll just summarize what a choice experiment is in terms of how you conduct one, and then go on to look at some of the applications which will hopefully put it into a little bit of a context. So the key thing with a choice experiment is you need to be able to decide your attributes and levels, and that's quite often decided by the policy question. Increasingly in health economics, we're using qualitative research to find out what patients want and use that to derive the attributes and levels. Once we've derived the attributes and levels, we then present respondents with a number of choices, where they make trade-offs. Would you choose profile A, the given set of attributes and associated levels, or profile B, with the same set of attributes and different levels? Individuals are generally presented with anything between 8 and 64 choices, and the jury's a wee bit out in terms of how many choices can people respond to. Because remember, and crucially, and I think we'll come on to look at this later and indeed tomorrow morning, these are hypothetical choices. So we're relying on individuals being honest. So in an economic jargon. We need to make these experiments incentive compatible to ensure people answer them truthfully. So we create these choices, and we use techniques from experimental design. We don't choose our choices randomly. If we have 5 attributes at 5 levels, let's say, we have 5 to the factorial, 5 possible combinations. We then use experimental design techniques to present individuals with a set of choices which allow us to infer their preferences for all profiles. So we've got our questionnaire. Of course, we've piloted it well. Increasingly, people are using internet panels to collect the data. Mailed surveys, when I started using these methods in the early 90s, were the common method. But I guess technology is moving on. Everybody has a gadget. People don't respond so much to mailed surveys anymore. And this was a wee bit of a shock for me when I did my first internet survey, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. And usually as a researcher, you get the questionnaire out, the older ones will remember this, and then you think, oh, I've got about 6 to 8 weeks where I can wait for the data to come in and actually do other things. But with the internet panel, your data comes in about 2 days. So we collect the data. Personal interviews, some people use them as well. Of course, the general issues that apply to survey design apply to choice experiments. So once we've done this, what information can we get from a choice experiment? So the first thing we would look at is whether the attributes are important. So do they have a significant impact on people's choices? And that's useful. But of course, we could have asked people directly if these attributes were important. The key contribution, I feel, of a choice experiment is that concept of trade-offs. So there's an assumption when you present people these choices that they're making trade-offs across the different attributes. And it's from that assumption, which we will come back tomorrow to, but it's from that assumption that we estimate what economists call marginal rates of substitution, but what can be translated into trade-offs. How much of one attribute are you willing to give up to have more of another attribute? So a common attribute that value is looked at in terms of is money. So if you include what's referred to as a cost attribute or a price proxy, you can indirectly estimate individuals' willingness to pay for improvements in the level of attributes. And following on from that, willingness to pay for a profile, a new way of providing care. So willingness to pay is, I think it's fair to say, the most common use of the choice experiment framework within health economics. But increasingly, 2 other areas are becoming more used. One is risk-benefit trade-offs. So rather than estimate value in terms of money, estimate value in terms of risk. So what increase in risk are people willing to accept for a better outcome? And also another numeraire that's used is time. How much longer are individuals willing to wait? So to estimate these marginal rates of substitution, you need to have a continuous attribute. And then finally, one other key output, and I think in terms of thinking about individual decision-making, behavioural economics, it's becoming increasingly useful, is you can estimate a probability of take-up. Your analytical framework is a probabilistic model. You predict the probability of an individual choosing A over B. So therefore, you can use this model to predict, if you're thinking of introducing a new service, to predict the uptake of that service. So that's choice experiments very much in a nutshell. How long have I got left? Oh, right, okay, really. Okay, so I just want to give you very, very briefly then why choice experiments were used in health economics. I think it's a really interesting history because the technique really developed in health economics in the early 90s. It grew out of a debate around going beyond QALYs in the UK. I was introduced to the Quality Adjusted Life Year framework as a master's student at the University of York in 1986-87, and I thought, there's got to be more to value than these. At the time, it was 2 dimensions. Do you remember distress and disability? The Rossakine matrix. It of course, then went on to be 5 dimensions via the Euro EQ5D. But nonetheless, I would argue that it's a very medical model of value. And if we look at health economics way back in the late 60s and early 70s, and I wasn't a health economist then, I speculate, but health economists did try to use willingness to pay, but I suspect at that time it was seen as very unethical to try and value life in money terms, despite the fact that transport economists were doing it on the value of a statistical life. So we've seen a shift away from the methods that economists use, monetary values, and the introduction of this concept known as cost-effectiveness analysis or cost-utility analysis in the UK if you do cost per quality. So way back then I was doing my PhD at the Health Economics Research Unit, where I'm still there 20 odd years later, with Cam Donaldson. And Professor Cam Donaldson, he reintroduced willingness to pay into the health economist toolbox, looking at going beyond QALYs. And I did my PhD introducing this method, which was known as conjoint analysis and is now referred to as discrete choice experiments. So very much within that debate, within economic evaluation, of going beyond the QALY. And where are we 20 odd years later? Well, in the UK at least, and I think some other European bodies are now recognising that the QALY is too narrow a measure of value, and we need to look at broader measures of value, and that choice experiments are often quoted within public documents as one method that can be used. But I think it's also important to note that actually, as long as you can break your research question down into attributes, you can potentially use choice experiments. So we have seen the application in a whole range of areas in economics, looking at individual decisions around lifestyle choices. How can we incentivize individuals to live well, looking at priority setting frameworks and community preferences, not just individual preferences, and indeed looking at doctors' decision making, an extensive literature in the human resources for health area around shortages in doctors and health workers, and how can we incentivize doctors to work in remote and rural areas. So I think the technique, we're seeing it used in a lot of areas. So it came out of this wish for patient-centered care, or person-centered care, which was broader than QALYs, but now a method that can be used very broadly. Of course, it's not without its limitations, benefits and costs, and I'll talk more about those tomorrow, but I think that's my time up on your crash course in discrete choice experiments. Thank you.
So I thank Mandy for this great job in setting the stage about what discrete choice experiments are, what are they useful for. I've been asked to talk more about the methodological issues related to discrete choice experiments. So the question I would like to discuss during this short talk is, what are discrete choice experiment preferences that we measure through discrete choice experiments useful for? What do they tell us, and what are the kind of issues related to this kind of measure? So there are two different kinds of questions one might ask, different kinds of concerns related to discrete choice experiments, elicitation of preferences. The first one is about the usefulness of the preferences that come from these measures, which is related to the question of whose preferences are we trying to measure. There are various kinds of economic agents. We had this discussion before during the first panel. There are patients, there are doctors, there are citizens, taxpayers. These are all different kinds of agents related to how the healthcare system works and whose preferences might be interesting from the point of view of health policy. So this is the first kind of question one needs to solve before moving to discrete choice experiments, for instance, and get some information about preferences. What is important, I think, beyond the question of stakeholders is the question of the kind of preferences, even for given agents, patients, doctors, taxpayers, the kind of preferences on which we want to get some information. That there is a kind of classical classification that distinguishes different kinds of willingness to pay for each and every economic agent. The first kind of preferences, or the first kind of willingness to pay, being individual preferences, so the amount of money I would like to pay for a change in my own situation based on my own preferences, which are different from the social preferences, which is what I would like my country or my society to achieve. And last, a mix between the two, which are socially inclusive preferences, where you take into account both your own situation and what happens to the society as a whole in your revealed willingness to pay through the experiment or the preference revelation exercise. And even for a given dimension of a given economic agent, a last very important dimension is the question of the time at which you want to elicit preferences. In particular, depending on whether you're interested in knowing what happens to people before any event occurs, ex ante, for instance, or exposed once you face a particular disease or illness, of course the willingness to pay will be different. So this all define different kinds of willingness to pay, different kinds of preferences, which needs to be defined before thinking about the usefulness of what we aim to measure. What is worth mentioning, I think, about this fact is that these all are very important dimensions of preferences. They are all interesting, and essentially the choice between them all depends on the main objective for which you need to get some information about preferences. Why do you want to measure preferences? To what objective? To what purpose? What kind of public decision making? This will drive the choice of the kind of economic agent, the kind of economic individual preferences, and the timing of these preferences that you want to measure. So this kind of question, which is the first kind of question of concern raised by discrete choice experiments, is a matter of parallelism. To what extent what we measure in the experiment is informative about what we aim to measure. The second kind of question, which is the main topic of my talk, is more a question about whether or not the data actually delivers what we aim to measure. What is the relationship between what we get from the experiment and what we want to know on a sample, on people from the sample. The first big concern of the application of discrete choice experiment to this particular kind of question is that answers elicited in discrete choice experiments are hypothetical in nature. So people are asked to tell us what option they prefer in a given bundle, but they do not face the monetary consequences of their decisions. So they can say everything they want, right? Which gives rise to a big concern which is called hypothetical bias, which is the difference between what people say in this kind of preference revelation exercise and what are their actual underlying preferences. There is some evidence that we might elicit preferences in an hypothetical context that actually give some information about what people are willing to do in real life, even if monetary consequences would be associated with these choices. One important contribution of behavioral economics is to highlight different kinds of non-rational behavior that arise in this kind of context and gives rise to a discrepancy between observed preferences in this kind of environment and the actual underlying preferences of respondents. One example is typically bounded rationality, which is related to what Mandy was talking about before. If you have many different dimensions of goods for which you try to elicit willingness to pay, it means that you ask people to make a lot of different choices with marginal differences between from one choice to the other. And hence, you might fail to actually reveal from them because their computational ability is limited, fail to have them actually make choices that is related to their underlying preferences. Another example about which Jim provided some examples are framing effects, which typically gives rise to different kinds of answers as regards to exactly the same preferences, which means we don't know then what is the relationship between what we actually measure and what are the underlying preferences. If when faced with the exact same question, people give different answers depending on the way you ask the question, then it means the answers are not that reliable because they are not related to underlying preferences. I will skip the other examples. I want to focus on the third kind of issue that arises related to this lack of reliability of preferences elicited in discrete choice experiments, that is related to whether respondents are truthful in their answers. And this idea that answers might not be truthful or are truthful is typically assumed in discrete choice experiments, because in a sense we don't have any reason to think that people will lie in a discrete choice experiment. One point that we are trying to make on recent works on this topic with colleagues is that in a sense the two are not the same. It's not the same to say that people have no reason to lie than saying that people will actually tell the truth when asked about their preferences. So what we are trying to do is to observe preferences revealed in a discrete choice experiment. In one particular context, I don't want to be too long about this and the details about this, but what is worth mentioning about that is we run a discrete choice experiment in a context in which we do observe the true underlying preferences based on which people are revealing their preferences, which means that we are able to contrast revealed preferences and true underlying preferences. Maybe tomorrow we will have discussion about how this can be done and the details of it. And we observe several interesting conclusions, I think, as regards to the reliability of revealed preferences. The first one is that we do not find any strong effect of the hypothetical context. So the lack of monetary incentives do not seem to have strong consequences on the accuracy of preferences that are observed in the discrete choice experiment. The second thing we observe is there is a strong lack of truthfulness in the answers. And in particular, we observe, and that's really shocking, we observe less than half answers that are consistent with the true underlying preferences that we have induced in the experiment. Which means that we might expect less than half answers to discrete choice experiments, for instance, to provide a reliable measure of individual preferences. The last thing we are trying to do is to induce commitment towards truthfulness from respondents. And we do observe that this significantly and to a large extent increases the truthfulness of our answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for having me here. It's a really great pleasure and honor. And I was asked to say something about behavioral economics application to health. And I would like to say something on three challenges of what I see as three main challenges of applying behavioral economics to health. And I think the first one is really that when you're actually applying behavioral economics to health, you're actually moving often in two steps forward with respect to the practice, in a sense that there is an underlying tension in behavioral economics. I should premise that I don't see behavioral economics in opposition to the conventional economics, but rather as an augmentation of economics, taking into account the insights from psychology, biology, and medical science to make it more, perhaps, fitting real-world decision and behavior. But having made this premise, I think the two steps are related to the tension that is in behavioral economics, because the economists within the behavioral economists strongly believe in the preferences. Actually, the economists are different from psychology, sociologists, epidemiologists, and medical doctors in the respect that we believe something exists which is called preferences. And that the behavioral side of behavioral economics is actually moving a step ahead and say, well, there are preferences, but actually the behavioral decision maker are actually taking decisions which are very often led by inconsistent preferences. So very often when we move to work in an interdisciplinary environment, we need to first introduce the importance of measuring preferences, and then showing that actually is only measuring preferences that you can show that there are inconsistent preferences. And why I'm saying that? Because I think it's very often the inclusion of the measurement of preferences is valuable in itself, although it may actually end up in not showing the existence of inconsistent preferences. I'm going to tell you more in few minutes what I mean. So this is the first area of challenge when we need to introduce an economic jargon in interdisciplinary environment, and we also release in the Ospinomics team, we often had some problems interacting with the non-economics teams. And the second aspect, which is related to the challenges of primary behavioral economics in health, is actually related to the source of evidence from behavioral economics. So behavioral economics is manifesting a lot of inconsistent or a violation of consistent behavior, but is mainly based on observation from small-scale lab experiment conducted with university students. So when you present the evidence of those biases or behavioral biases to medical decision makers or policy makers, they often look at you as a fool, because you're actually giving too much weight to what actually they are weird sample in a sense of Western educated high income sample, which are actually based heavily on a student population. But that is precisely the second challenge, because there is no need to focus on the preferences and the violation of preferences of student samples. And in fact, what a lot more of behavioral and experimental economists in health are doing are considering non-student sample. The work by Mandy, Nicolas is also in this direction, Antoine, Leontini, Liz. So they're also considering sample of patients, sample of medical doctors, sample of the medical decision maker, and measuring the preferences for those samples. And another area which is relevant for the consideration of the first half of the day is actually nothing prevents us to go and measure the preferences or about represent the sample of the population, and doing something similar in the UK. And you can actually move a step ahead, because actually you can take full advantage of the idea that actually, first of all, there is not one single type of experiment. There are the discrete choice experiment, there are lab experiment, but there are artifactual field experiment, frame field experiment, natural field experiment. There is a whole spectrum of experiment you can use in health. And secondly, in health we have something that few other areas in social policy, public policy have. We have amazing data in terms of registered data, in terms of biomarkers data. And there is no reason why we should keep on continuing doing data analysis with big data, biomarkers data, registered data, completely detached from behavioral experiment. We can have the best of both worlds and conducting behavioral experiment with sample for which you can link the data for registered biomarkers, which is something we also want actually to explore here at Ospinomics. Which is leading to the third challenge, I think, which has already been mentioned by Mandy and Nicolas. And I think is when you actually including a lot of behavioral tests within surveys, within biomarkers, bank, or within registered data, of course, in order to detect a significant violation of consistency, you need to have a lot of questions. And because of the hypothetical bias, in order to make sure that the subject have incentive to generally reveal their underlying preferences, you have to ensure to pay out real monetary rewards. And that is creating a tension, of course, because you are actually, you need to have a lot of infrastructure to measure preferences, and then is creating a very fertile area where you can triangulate different type of data, and not just experimental data with real monetary rewards, but also survey data. Very direct questions on traits or attitudes, very often they get very close to the answer. People provide genuine answer to also to very simple questions, and actually that is an area where we should do more systematic research. And I'll probably stop here. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the invitation to contribute to this panel. I'm a baby boomer. So one of the advantages of getting older, I realise, is that you actually get ordered around less as you age. This is the positive thing. So my entire instructions from Lise for this panel, I've written them down here. No PowerPoint, tell them about happiness. So that's what I'm going to do, and if you don't like it, you know who to blame. So the first question that's going to come up here is how you actually measure happiness. My work is exclusively based on secondary data, so that means it's not my fault, right? I don't design the questionnaire, but it is my problem, and that someone else is designing the questionnaires on health, happiness, and so on, and that will, of course, entirely 100% flavour the quality of any analysis that we carry out. So you may think you know how to measure health. I'm not going to question you on that. That might be right. But how on earth do we measure happiness? Now, the most common measures of what I'm going to call happiness, though it covers all kinds of subjective well-being, are single item. This drives psychologists, people in medical research, absolutely mad, right? It's just a very simple question along the lines of how satisfied are you with your life overall, or how happy are you in general these days? Answered on an ordinal scale, 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 0 to 10. The quick-witted amongst you will have noted those are all odd scales. We provide a natural neutral for people who don't really know what the question is about. These were answered on paper, then they were answered on computer screen, which makes life a wee bit easier. There is an issue about providing numbers, whether that provides a maximum and you have an aversion to that maximum. There's some interesting work on visual analog scales where nothing is labelled whatsoever and you just have a top and a bottom, and you can get some quite similar results there. Alternatively, the measures can be multi-item like the GHQ-12 or the CASP-19 or something like that, and we just add up the answers. So the first thing to say about this is everyone understands these questions. If I ask, well, okay, not people in this room, because you're going to be difficult. If I ask normal people, should we say, how satisfied are you with your life? Everyone has an answer to that. Nobody says, I don't know what that question means. And the survey non-response on well-being questions is fantastically low compared to the response on other things we think we're interested in, like income, for example, where it's borders on the farcical sometimes. So these happiness questions are easily available, and they look a little bit like health questions. Life satisfaction looks a bit like self-assessed health. The GHQ-12 looks a bit like the count of the limitations on daily life. So why should we consider happiness rather than just health in its own right? Well, the first obvious answer is that what makes a good life consists of much more than just health. Health is only one of the inputs into what we think of as the utility function, what we can here call individual welfare. And in the sense that no one maximises their health. Otherwise, none of us would be in this room. Nobody acts in order to maximise their health. We maximise something that depends on health and loads of other things like income, education, family, my emotional health, my employment and things like that. So I don't think of health as an end in its own right, but rather as an input into an individual welfare or utility function that depends on loads of other things at the same time. And if you look as to where health ranks in terms of other stuff in your life, it's in the middle somewhere. It's about as important as your income and your conduct relative to others. It's less important than your partnership status and much less important than your emotional health. And I'm making the distinction between physical and emotional health there. Okay. Happiness is then different from health. It's also different in terms of the reliability of the measure. You asked me to talk about reliability. This is your problem as well, right? So we sort of know when someone's healthy. We can either ask them, are you healthy? And they give you an answer. Or we can make them take some kind of medical checkup. We can ask people whether they're happy. What we don't have is some kind of standard happiness checkup you can do. So there is a real worry about the validity, reliability of these kinds of measures. Are they just noise? The worries here are to do with individual response style, the reporting function. I'm always miserable, so I'll always give you a low answer. And then there's time varying miserable. Right? So I just happened to have recently argued with my partner. I spilt my coffee, my football team lost. That's true, actually, they did. And things like that. So in a time varying way, I'm going to give you a low well-being answer. Though people make a lot of this. I should underline that if this is a symmetric distribution of football team winning and losing, and it's independent of the stuff we're interested in, this doesn't make much difference. It's just classical measurement error. Okay, so it's not a bias, if you like, it just makes it less accurate. Okay, and there's also the things that Angus Deaton have insisted on, like priming, question order. His nice paper in the Oxford Economic Papers in 2012 showed that, using a split sample in Gallup Healthways, showed that having a simple question on how do you think the US economy is doing produced a score on the Cantrell 0 to 10 scale that was 2/3 of a point lower. So these are big, big priming effects. Now we can deal with some of these via questionnaire design. We can deal with these via using panel data where we repeatedly interview the same people. I've got this section here that says we can also use physiological correlations, but I was writing this up earlier and realised I didn't really know any. I think there should be correlations between happiness and cortisol, but I actually don't know too much about this. I know left-right prefrontal brain asymmetry, the Peter Urey stuff, but there's not a lot around on physiological validation. But a general response here is that people who are unhappy or people who are happy, they behave as if they really were happy or unhappy. So you can use prospective analyses to show that people with low well-being scores quit their job, they quit the labour force, they stay unemployed longer, happy people get married more, and arguably most of the cross-section correlation between marriage and well-being that we're all aware of is due to a pure selection effect, that miserable people don't get married. And you might want to think about that in terms of health. We can predict separation, we can predict having children, again in a prospective sense. And perhaps most strikingly, and I wish Andrew Steptoe was here now, if I took a cross-section distribution of well-being scores amongst all of you, I could have a pretty good stab at predicting the order in which you'll die. Okay, so you can use cross-section well-being scores to predict not only morbidity, but also mortality 10, 12 years in the future. Okay, this is meant to be on health behaviours, so let me move on to that. I don't want to take up too much time. There's useful information, I think, then, in these answers to simple happiness questions. And following what Pierre-Yves said in his introduction, why don't we just look at reveal preferences via behaviour then? Why do we need this fancy happiness stuff? And that's what's standard to do in economics. We infer preferences from what people do. This doesn't take into account constraints, of course. We assume that people can do exactly what they want. My first ever published well-being paper was on unhappiness and unemployment. The unemployed are unhappier than the employed. You know, waits for gasps of shock. In the 1970s and 1980s, we didn't think this was true. We thought that unemployment was a choice, and as Angus Deaton has rightly pointed out, anything that's a choice shouldn't necessarily be correlated with well-being in any sense whatsoever. It's like asking, do you like cheese sandwiches? I mean, okay, so you like cheese sandwiches. To buy a cheese sandwich, why should that be correlated with how well you feel versus someone who prefers, a tranquillité? It's not really very clear that. Okay, so if we look at well-being, we can actually get an idea about where the constraints might lie. A parallel question is smoking and happiness. What do we know about smoking and happiness? One of the bizarrest findings in social science, don't listen to this, Pierre-Yves, right? This is, actually, you too, Nicola. This is a really, really weird thing. Okay, lots of people smoke. And then when you ask smokers, do you want to stop? They say yes. Just how can we understand that response? If you want to stop, why don't you? And one understanding of that answer is that the reply yes is actually not about preference, it's about meta-preferences. It's not about what I want to do, it's what I wish I wanted to do. Another is that you do want to stop, and like the unemployed who can't get a job, there's something actually stopping you from making that decision, be it two-stage decision-making or something like that. And we can think of broadly as addiction. And in the context of happiness, the Gruber and Mullainathan paper that showed that smokers are happier as cigarette taxes rise can only be understood, really, as revealing some kind of constraint through addiction. I'm being happy to be forced into doing something that I'd like to do, but I can't make it. And that's not something you would ever, ever be able to back out from observational data on what people do. Okay? What people do is not a good guide to their preferences in some cases. This is certainly one of them. I realise I'm running out of time, so shall I just skip? I'm going to skip a bit here. Shall I skip a bit? Let's skip a bit. What the hell? No, actually, no, let's not do this. This is my notes. I'm going to read my notes here. My notes say, economist sentence, everyone else can switch off for 10 seconds. It's easy to imagine a changes in prices or something that will alter your well-being or health and will have no effect on your behaviour. It's very, very easy to write that down. If you have a separable utility function, a change in something, a price, can affect your utility but not affect the marginal utilities. And as we all know, our behaviour is determined by marginal utility, not the level of utility. And it's very, very simple to write that one down. Again, revealed preferences are no use to you, but there is a well-being or a health reaction. I think we need to know both of these things. Okay, so I'm almost on the last page, you'll be happy to hear. I can't even read what this says. Oh no, I'm going to skip that. I really am going to skip that. Okay, I am going to skip that. Let me finish with problems. I've argued, and I do believe actually genuinely, this is not just sheer provocation, that happiness is a useful addition to the analysis of health and to the analysis of behaviour. And what can possibly go wrong, it says here now. So here's a couple of ideas about things that can go wrong when we take the happiness approach. The first is one I really don't understand very well, adaptation to health. We all know what that means. Well, okay, let me say what it means. It doesn't mean you get less ill over time. It doesn't mean you learn how to use a wheelchair if you become a paraplegic. I'm thinking of adaptation in the psychological sense of a reduced reaction to a constant stimulus. Okay? So imagine that you do get used to disability to some extent. Does that matter? And for whom does it matter? If we were decision makers and people who became paraplegics got used to it, should we invest less in paraplegics compared to something else? I don't know the answer to that question. Of course, a flip side to that is if I don't predict that I'll adapt to a health problem, I will overinvest in health for a well-being point of view, in the same way that people overinvest in large houses. So they're making systematic mistakes. So that's the first issue, adaptation. Second is social comparisons. Some health issues may be comparative in nature. One that I've worked up with Fabrice Tillé is BMI. Overweight people have lower well-being. Overweight people in overweight areas have lower well-being, but not as lower by as much. Overweight people with overweight partners don't have low well-being at all. There's a perfect match in body weight. So that indicator that we think of as a non-comparative indicator of health is actually comparative. Another one is height, though there's not much we can do about height. We know that height is correlated with good outcomes on the labour market, for example. But it's not clear that that's due to a physiological or a psychological return. For example, in Thailand, I'm pretty much the tallest person in the whole country by about 50 centimetres, right? I'm actually under the average height of the new cohort of Danish men. I'm actually quite small, and I feel that when I'm in Copenhagen. Oh, God. So I believe the return to that to that health measure again is not absolute, but it's comparative. And this is a huge discussion in other areas of economics. It's not a discussion in health particularly, though I think it should be. Okay, here's my last point. We don't have just one measure of happiness, we've got loads of them. We've got the cognitive evaluative, like life satisfaction. Secondly, we've got affect. That's how do you feel at this minute. That's what experience momentary sampling day reconstruction method picks up. Okay, a photo of you right this second. Thirdly, there are non-hedonic, non-life satisfactions covering meaning, purpose, and accomplishment, which are called eudaimonic. Okay, so that's the idea of flourishing, developing potential. These are correlated, but not that well. Which leads me to my last question. If we were to design a health policy, which one of these would we take as our maximand? Would we like to have a happy life or a meaningful one? So this is Socrates versus the happy pig. Though it actually turns out in correlational terms, Socrates was pretty happy as well. But imagine there is a distinction between the two. Do you want meaning or do you want pleasure? How would you trade those two off? And even more difficult, and this is my last line, is the relationship between affect, that's momentary utility, and cognitive evaluative well-being, that's your reflection on your life as a whole. One is a photo, the other, if you like, is the film. It turns out that the series of photos doesn't look anything like your memory of the film. And that there's the infamous paper by Danny Kahneman and Riedelmeier looking at an invasive surgical procedure and experienced and remembered pain. People systematically prefer more pain, because they remember it as being less painful. That's a little bit of a toy example. We can certainly imagine it in a more general context, where people systematically choose things that they remember as being good, but actually aren't as you live them from day to day. And my notes now say, I have no answer to that question. I will therefore pass you over to the next speaker. We actually inverted the order, so I am the last speaker. So I'll pass you over to Pierre-Yves, who has an answer to that question.